and welcome to the Hirsch Lauterbach Memorial Lectures 2021. This year, the lectures are being delivered online in deference to the pandemic restrictions. But one of the compensating aspects of that is that these lectures can reach live to a much bigger audience than we could have fit into our center's Finley Library. We have today with us an audience of several hundred, and a very warm welcome to each one of you from all of us at the Lauterbach Center. We hope you will stay with us for all three lectures, that is today, tomorrow, and Thursday, and will join us on Friday for a Q&A with the speaker. So please do hold your questions till then. A very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker for this year, Professor Susan Marks. Professor Marks needs no introduction. In the audience tonight are her students and former students, her friends and colleagues from the LSE, where she is a professor of international law, from King's College London and Cambridge, where she taught before, and from so many other places. The audience includes people mentored by Professor Marks over hundreds of workshops and seminars and conferences, and many, many others for whom Professor Marks's writings have been a source of inspiration over the years. Professor Marks's major works include The Incisive, The Riddle of All Constitutions, an exploration of ideas and ideologies of democracy, the lovely International Human Rights Lexicon, an innovative examination of concepts and themes in international human rights law, the groundbreaking edited volume, International Law on the Left, exploring the contemporary relevance of Marxist thought for international law, and most recently, the wonderful A False Tree of Liberty, a history of the idea of human rights, connecting debates on the rights of man and developments within the history of capitalism. I must mention here also her several deeply thoughtful and beautifully written essays that are an endlessly giving source of ideas, critiques, and really ways of looking at the world. I cannot list all, but to recall just a few: false contingency, exploitation as a legal concept, the account of planned misery in human rights and root causes, and apologizing for torture are just four of the several that I have gone back to often to think with and of course to teach with. Professor Marks's work has shaped the fields of international human rights law, critique, and international law's political economy, and it is with thrilled anticipation that I hand over the microphone to her for her present lectures on dignity. Professor Marks, welcome, thank you, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sarati. What an extraordinary introduction. I feel a bit like crying, actually. That is amazing. Thank you. It is an immense honor to be giving these lectures dedicated to the immortal memory of Hirsch Lauterbach, whose son Ellie we all greatly miss, and whom I had the privilege of knowing as a wonderfully knowledgeable teacher and paragon of eloquence and graciousness. I am humbled to follow in the line of an extraordinarily distinguished array of lecturers, and I want to pay tribute to the founders and organizers of this lecture series, from which I and countless others have learned so much. I also want to pay tribute to the publishers of the books that have come out of the series. Finola O'Sullivan at Cambridge University Press is surely the international legal equivalent of a national treasure. At this point in starting, I'd like to share my screen with you. So let me try and do that now. I think that's hopefully worked, has it? Great. So the subject of my lectures is dignity. I want to state up front that this is not an original topic. In researching it, I found that dignity has been the subject of a number of other lecture series, including the Benedict Lectures at Boston University, for which in 2007 Michael Rosen spoke about dignity, and the Tanner Lectures, which saw Jeremy Waldron address the same issue in 2009 at UC Berkeley. I take from the evident popularity of the topic a sense that dignity is important, and not just to a narrow band of specialists, but to people in general. On the other hand, and despite all this attention, I believe that we have yet to get to grips with it as well as we might. For reasons which will emerge, I believe that there is more that needs to be said on this much rehearsed theme. Outside the academy, we've heard a lot about dignity in this past year. COVID-19 has, of course, overshadowed everything, and it's been reported that responses to the pandemic stand as a test for respect of human dignity worldwide. One reads criticism of policy proposals that seemed to rely on ideas of herd immunity on the grounds that they subordinated human dignity by treating it as a quantifiable entity that could be weighed in the balance. So too, one learns of calls for measures implemented to protect populations against COVID-19 to be appropriately framed so that they respect the dignity of older people and other vulnerable groups. Let me see if I can show you my first slide here. So there you see Antonio Guterres speaking to the late Tom Moore about the dignity of older people. At a special session of the UN General Assembly convened to discuss the crisis in December last year, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed declared that, now quoting, "the right decisions now will secure a life of dignity for all." Meanwhile, palliative care physician Harvey Chochinov and colleagues have warned of a failure to take into account the effect of COVID-19 measures on the concept and practice of death with dignity. If the first casualty of war is truth, they write, the first casualty of coronavirus disease for patients nearing death is dignity. The other major context in which we've heard about dignity a lot in the past year relates to United States politics. When Donald Trump first became president, Arthur Brooks, head of the American Enterprise Institute, said that dignity was why Trump got elected. According to Brooks, Trump taught people their own dignity and helped them to understand that they should have dignity too. In a less appreciative assessment 2 years later, another conservative, Michael Gerson, wrote that our president lacks dignity. George Washington made dignity the defining commitment of his political life, but Trump has made the denial of dignity to certain people and groups a political rallying cry. During the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, you could buy merchandise from the Never Trump campaign that included a t-shirt with the legend, "Dignity for all people." As for the months after the election, I passed quickly over the moment when someone dug out a December 2016 Trump tweet, repeating a statement by Putin that Hillary Clinton should be able to accept defeat with dignity, and adding, "so true." I simply recall some of the headlines of that time. Obama to Trump, "salvage your last speck of dignity and concede now." Fox News's Geraldo Rivera urges Trump, "exit with dignity and grace." In his inaugural address on the 20th of January this year, President Biden made 3 references to dignity, admittedly rather fewer than his references to unity and democracy, but still. He said that Americans can treat each other with dignity and respect. He put dignity in a list of the 7 common objects we love that define us as Americans. And he declared that together we shall write an American story of, among other good things, decency and dignity. To focus on dignity is to pick out one of a cluster of terms that includes self-respect, self-esteem, honor, decorum, propriety, integrity, respectability, reputation, regard, pride, prestige, confidence, consideration, worthiness, politeness, and civility. Dignity is special for a variety of reasons on which I will have occasion to touch. But one aspect is that it is said to belong innately to all human beings. Whether we consult constitutions and human rights instruments, or popular psychology texts and school teaching materials, we will be informed that dignity is inherent, something that everyone just has. What then does it mean to say that Donald Trump helped people to understand that they should have dignity too, or conversely, made the denial of dignity to certain people and groups a political rallying cry? What does it mean to say that the right decisions now will secure a life of dignity for all? If dignity is inherent, we know that in reality, the experience of it is far from universal. However clear we may be that dignity belongs to everyone, there can be no mistaking that it is very unevenly distributed. These lectures will be concerned with the politics of dignity, by which I mean its enmeshment in structured relationships of power. I want to try to shed light on the significance of dignity as a worldly concept, a concept that has social effects and is equally an outcome of social processes. The idea that dignity has social effects raises the question not only of what dignity is, what it means, but also of what it does, how it works, as part of the phenomena that configure the world and our relationships within it. The idea that dignity is an outcome of social processes raises the question of how, in turn, the world configures dignity. Let me pause over that second aspect, how the world configures dignity. For many people and many scholars, dignity is a moral precept, or at any rate, a normative principle of some sort. Discussions of dignity in that register can often make it seem as though we confront an object, to use Joe Biden's word, that has reached society or the mind fully formed. They can make dignity seem unworldly, even otherworldly. I am interested in the ways in which dignity is instead produced, defined, shaped, and contested in and through collective human activity, including, as we shall see in my final lecture, juridical activity. The concept of dignity has had a high-profile role in policy debates within bioethics, and in that field, some scholars have criticized it as stupid, their word, or at least useless. In a famous paper from 2003, bioethicist Ruth Macklin argued that dignity was a useless concept because it was hopelessly vague, her phrase, and insofar as it could be rendered meaningful, it meant, again quoting, nothing more than a capacity for rational thought and action, the central features conveyed in the principle of respect for autonomy. So why not stick to that? In the field of human rights, where, as we shall see, the concept of dignity has also been prominent, Samuel Moyn has maintained, along somewhat related lines, that, now quoting from him, a consensus about dignity may have become deep enough for us to insist that the state not torture, but it has proved far less helpful when some of us insist that our fellow humans care about one another's broader welfare or collective emancipation. In these lectures, I will not be seeking to identify the scope of consensus about dignity or its utility relative to competing concepts, but nor will I be assuming that dignity is always a good thing. Indeed, one of the things I will be examining is what happens when people depart from an established dignity script and embrace indignity for the sake of showing up the limits of what passes for dignified life. What that often means in practice is showing up the ways in which the dignity of some depends on affixing indignity to others. A particular source of inspiration for the approach I adopt here is the work of Sara Ahmed, and especially her writing about happiness. Near the beginning of The Promise of Happiness, Ahmed explains that she wishes to write a history of happiness from the point of view of those who are banished from it, or who enter its history only as troublemakers, dissenters, or killers of joy. It is my wager in these lectures that one might similarly consider dignity from the perspective of its outsiders, those who reject or are denied it, and thereby be led to interrogate that which ordinarily we only ever defend. The lecture series proceeds, as you know, in 3 parts. In the remainder of this first lecture, I'll review something of the associations of dignity in daily life. I take it that the primary setting for dignity is the quotidian realm, so an appropriate starting point for getting to grips with it and its politics seems to be there. In the second lecture, I'll shift the focus to more theoretical concerns about the idea of human dignity. There exists a largely settled story about the history of the idea of human dignity, which I will relate but also wonder about. In the third and final lecture, I will present one of several pieces of research in which I'm engaged that investigate dignity at particular times in particular places. Whilst it would have been nice to leave some suspense, I fear the title of that lecture on the Lauterpacht Center website gives the game away: Dignity and Indignity in the South African Toilet Wars. It goes without saying that my everyday life is not your or the next person's everyday life, but please allow me to begin with the habits of the country in which I live and in which the Lauterpacht Center indeed is situated. If you look up dignity in a search engine adapted for the United Kingdom, an astonishing number of entries in the initial pages relate to death and dying. The UK's largest provider of funeral services is a listed company called Dignity. And the major provider of pet cremation services also has that word in its name. Assisted suicide is illegal in the UK, but the Latin root word dignitas is well known as the name of a place in Switzerland where you can go to end your life. Dignitas is a non-profit member society which takes as its motto to live with dignity, to die with dignity. The concept of death with dignity is one we hear about a lot in the context of debates about euthanasia, assisted suicide, and the right to die. Apart from that association with death and dying, dignity has a strong association with healthcare, social care, and matters of personal hygiene. So, for example, there exists a campaign in the United Kingdom for period dignity, while toilet dignity is a pressing issue in many countries. The material to be presented in my third lecture will exemplify that. In 2018, an organisation was set up in Scotland to distribute what it calls dignity boxes. The boxes contain basic toiletries, and the system is that people donate toiletry items which are then put into small boxes that are left openly in places with high levels of deprivation, to be taken and used by people in need. By making available daily necessities of this kind, without the recipients having to ask or thank anyone, the organisation hopes, in its words, to promote in a small way self-worth and dignity. The National Dignity Council of the United Kingdom is a network of health and social care professionals and others dedicated to promoting what it calls dignity in care. Dignity in care is the basis of a 10-point dignity challenge, which the Council has elaborated, comprising 10 key points, so-called dignity do's, to ensure high-quality services that respect people's dignity. I will touch in more detail on what's set out there a bit later in this lecture. To help in carrying forward its work, the Council has designated the 1st of February an annual Dignity Action Day, and it's appointed a Dignity Ambassador and Dignity Champions. Posters and leaflets prepared or inspired by the National Dignity Council can be seen in doctors' surgeries and hospitals throughout the country. This emphasis on dignity extends to the field of medical technology. In healthcare supplier Wernicare's A to Z of patient care, D is for dignity. The dignity, as it says, not just as of patients, not just as patients, but as people. Wade Ceramics is a manufacturer of porcelain products that produces an assistive tableware range, which it calls Dignity. Among the items available are a two-handed cup and a plate with wide rims designed for people with Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Underscoring the fact that these pieces are made out of vitrified earthenware, the company quotes an expert in dementia services. If it's not a picnic, there should be no plastic. Another company makes a waterless shampoo that can be used in bed, which is likewise labeled Dignity. Perhaps connecting some of the issues on which I've already touched, elder care is a sphere in which dignity has had particular prominence. The Observer newspaper once ran a campaign for dignity at home, posing the question, is dignity at home too much to ask for our elderly? It was reported that, now quoting, hundreds of thousands of Britain's elderly rely on home care visits to live a dignified life in their own house. But as local authorities reduce funding, an increasing number of our most vulnerable citizens are being neglected. The example given was a 72-year-old woman from Essex who was housebound due to severe arthritis and suffered from incontinence. After reducing the number of baths to which she was entitled every week from 2 to 1, the authorities had told her that even that was to end, and she would have to make do with a daily sponge down. What are some of the other contexts in which a discourse of dignity can be heard? Well, where I work, as in many other British workplaces, one can, if one wishes, consult a dignity at work statement. The statement proclaims the goal of promoting an enabling and inclusive environment where all staff are treated with dignity and respect. And it sets out expectations regarding appropriate behavior, along with the means by which inappropriate behavior, which falls short of bullying or harassment, can be easily identified, addressed, and resolved. At LSE, bullying and harassment are dealt with in a separate discrimination, harassment, and bullying policy. Inappropriate behavior is defined as any behavior which is unwanted, unwelcome, and undermines an individual's dignity at work. And this is further clarified through a series of examples. Given the phenomenon of statements such as that, one should not be surprised that dignity has had high visibility in management consulting and executive coaching. Donna Hicks is the author of a book entitled Leading with Dignity: How to Create a Culture That Brings Out the Best in People. Starting from the claim that whatever the setting, a key to being successful is dignity consciousness, the book outlines a program for building a team and creating an organizational culture that honors dignity, in its words. Motivational speaker and advisor Glenn Yopis advises that, now quoting, human dignity must serve as the foundation for the ways we think, act, and innovate. We can't elevate the capacity of individuals without first building trust, and we can't build trust without first honoring the dignity of the person before us. Let me mention one final association with dignity, which now takes us outside the English-speaking world. The Arabic world, which I think is pronounced something like karama, and is conventionally translated as dignity, is widely held to have been a central concept in the Arab Spring of the early 2010s. Echoing an earlier nationalist slogan, Abdel Wahab El Afendi said at the time that the point was not just to demand jobs and bread. The uprisings were needed, he said, so that the people would deserve bread. The uprisings were needed to restore the dignity of the people. Asteadat karamat al-na'as. It is notable that the Tunisian Revolution is sometimes referred to as the Dignity Revolution, Tarwat al-Karama, and that the Tribunal of Transitional Justice, which was set up in the country, in Tunisia, was named the Truth and Dignity Commission, now using the French Instance Vérité et Dignité. In February 2020, an incident occurred in Jordan, which brought back memories of the self-immolation of the Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, to which the events of the Arab Spring are often traced. The incident involved a Jordanian street vendor, Anas al-Jamra. Harassed like Bouazizi by city officials seeking to exact unpayable license fees, and like Bouazizi too, without alternative means of supporting himself and his family, al-Jamra took his own life. It was reported that the death of Anas al-Jamra, now quoting, highlights the struggle of people to earn a dignified living in Jordan, where many feel that wealth and opportunities are restricted to a privileged few. As his great uncle explained, the dead man, now quoting again, was very hardworking and responsible. He worked every day. Sometimes he left the house at 6 in the morning and only came back at night after 10. He just wanted to live with dignity. There you see Anas al-Jamra and his great uncle. From this small and inevitably restricted set of references and associations, we can already learn or allow ourselves to be reminded of a few salient facts about dignity. In particular, I want to highlight 3 facts and go into them a little more deeply. In the first place, it may be observed that dignity is not just an idea. It's not just something that has existence in our heads. It's also performative, embodied, and ineliminably relational. Dignity is a social practice and a lived experience. This embodied aspect of dignity becomes immediately apparent if we inflect from the noun dignity to the adjective dignified. Variously defined in dictionaries as marked by dignity of manner, style, or appearance, but also stately, noble and majestic, decorous, controlled and calm, and having or showing a serious manner that is worthy of respect. And here you see some stock photos designed to depict a dignified appearance. Giorgio Agamben advises that even the Latin and medieval concept of dignitas, which, as I will discuss further in my next lecture, was primarily a matter of elevated status or personage, also denoted the physical appearance appropriate to that status or personage. When it comes to contemporary English, Andrew Sayre recalls that dignity is rendered in the language of posture, comportment, facial expression, and spatial orientation. We speak of holding one's head up high, of standing tall and not stooping low, of saving face, keeping a level head, and maintaining composure. We speak of people, in this case always other people, being above certain things which they consider beneath their dignity. As that last reference indicates, sometimes what is involved seems to be arrogance, haughtiness, or snobbery. And Sayre remarks that indeed, dignity can easily be confused with rank and dominance. Again, I'll have more to say about that in my next lecture. At the same time, we speak of the difficulties people may face of standing on their dignity and standing up for themselves. Inalienable, imprescriptible, and irrefragable dignity may be, but it is also fragile and precarious, and very much more so for some of us than for others, and for all of us at some times of our lives more than at others. It follows from that fragility that what matters is not just how people conduct themselves, but also how they are enabled to conduct themselves. That dignity is centrally concerned with the treatment we receive from other people, and with the extent to which others support or instead undermine the possibility of a dignified bearing on our part, is the premise of a large body of scholarship in fields that include medicine, nursing, and social work. As a prelude to looking at something of that, let us return to the UK National Dignity Council's decalogue of dignity dues. For there we will find many widely circulating ideas about what it is for a doctor, nurse, social worker, or other health or social care professional to treat someone they are looking after with dignity. So there you see the list. Enable people to maintain the maximum possible level of independence, choice, and control. Listen and support people to express their needs and wants, respect people's privacy, ensure people feel able to complain without fear of retribution, assist people to maintain confidence and positive self-esteem, and so on. Treat each person as an individual as well, by offering a personalized service. Medical researcher and practitioner Harvey Chochinov, I mentioned a co-authored paper he wrote in connection with coronavirus at the beginning of this lecture, has applied these ideas to the context of end-of-life care, outlining an influential model of palliative care, which he terms dignity-conserving care. The model breaks down the issues affecting dignity into several categories and identifies therapeutic interventions specific to each that can be made to conserve the patient's dignity. Finding ways to help the patient live in the moment and maintaining normality to the maximum extent possible are examples of these. Jeanette Poltz has investigated dignity in the sphere of health and social care in a different register, using a primarily ethnographic mode of inquiry. In one paper, she presents the results of a study she conducted on care practices in 2 institutional settings in the Netherlands, an innovative psychiatric hospital and a more traditional geriatric residential home. In particular, she looked at how the nurses or care workers handled patients or residents who did not want to wash or be washed. Did they force the patients to wash or be washed? And whatever their decision, in what terms did they justify that decision? It transpired that the nurses in the psychiatric hospital did not force patients to wash. They said things like, "I let her keep her dignity, in the sense that I take it she will look after herself." For them, again quoting, washing or not washing was a private matter to be decided on by the patient. In contrast, the care workers at the geriatric residential home did force reluctant residents to be washed. They saw washing as part of the clean and well-kept appearance which they tried to maintain for residents. They said things like, "It's out of bed in the morning, washing so that the residents can look nice and so that they can at least feel good about that. I find that really important. It's their sense of dignity." Polls found that ultimately there were limits. At a certain point, the psychiatric nurses admitted that they could no longer stand it and insisted that a patient take a shower. Equally, the geriatric care workers accepted that some residents were not accustomed to frequent bathing and that there was no need to get into a fight every day. The general point that Poltz wants us to take from this research is that dignity has 2 aspects that together help us to understand its meaning in this context. On the one hand, there is privacy in the sense of autonomy, the dignity that comes from self-command and from making decisions about your life for yourself. On the other hand, there is looking nice, the dignity that comes from fitting in with relevant social norms to do with what is pleasant and decorous and expressive of self-respect. Of course, these two aspects often converge. In another study, Pulse interviewed women who'd lost their hair due to cancer treatment. She found that the women responded to the changes in the way they looked in a variety of ways, some wearing wigs, some wearing scarves, others still remaining comfortable with their baldness. But however they did so, their dignity could not be considered in isolation from the societal value of looking good and what that meant to them. Let me turn now to a second fact about dignity. It's a social practice and a lived experience, but not a single set of social practices and lived experiences. For if dignity is irreducibly relational, it is also irreducibly plural. Here we will do well to make further reference to the substantial literature on dignity in anthropology, as well as to writing in sociology, business ethics, and other fields that address the diverse ways in which dignity is produced or not produced at diverse geographical and social locations. Alex Nading studied the work of food safety inspectors in a district of Managua in Nicaragua and observed that interactions there were rendered more dignified to those involved insofar as the owners of food businesses joked with inspectors and gave them gifts. Making light of the situation and offering and accepting gifts were not simple manifestations of official incompetence or corruption. In the specific circumstances, they were means, Nading explains, of building dignity into the process of governmental surveillance and audit. Through them, inspection came to seem less like law enforcement and more like participation in a shared effort to make, in Nading's words, cooking, selling, and bureaucratically accounting for food commensurable as forms of dignified work. Ernesto Noronha and colleagues examined the experience of security guards in an Indian city working at two kinds of sites: pavement kiosks with automatic teller machines and the premises of large-scale commercial or industrial enterprises. While those who guarded the ATM machines told of poor working conditions and persistent vituperation from passers-by, security guards at the commercial or industrial premises described how their dignity was maintained. For them, dignity could be derived from being required to wear an ironed uniform, keep careful records of their patrols, not chat on the phone while on duty, and remain calm and polite in the case of an altercation. As Noronha and colleagues gloss it, dignity and discipline coalesced in the lives of these guards. At the same time, their dignity came from, in Noronha and colleagues' words, the respect and recognition of others. Unlike the ATM guards, these guards were mostly treated courteously and with consideration in their daily interactions. They received training and saw their working conditions improve. The enterprises whose premises they guarded invited them to festive occasions. Disciplined soldiers, these guards may in some sense have been, but it was also important, as Noronha and colleagues explain, that they were respected persons. I mentioned earlier the association of dignity with personal hygiene, a service occupation which is often seen as presumptively dignity wounding because it involves dirty work, is garbage collection. Peter Hamilton and colleagues spent time with a group of refuse collectors and street cleaners, all of them men, employed by a local authority in the northeast of England. it emerged that indeed the refuse collectors and street cleaners had experience of offence. Members of the public would walk past them holding their noses, for example, or castigate them when they declined to pick up contaminated waste as though they were errant servants. Yet Hamilton and colleagues observed that the garbage workers did not consider themselves to be engaged in undignified work, thanks to a series of self-representational narratives. Namely, the men recoded their negatively coded dirty work as positive by highlighting its social and environmental usefulness. They also developed self-esteem through favorable comparison with alternative work, such as robotic, as their word, factory work. And they emphasized a form of heroic masculinity that consisted of looking out for vulnerable members of the community while doing their rounds, and always being willing, in their words, to go the extra mile. By means of these interlinked narratives, the authors report, the refuse collectors and street cleaners with whom this research was conducted successfully imbued themselves and their work with dignity. Dignity then is not one thing but many things, and those many things are bound up with the particularity of social and geographical location. A third, and as with the others interconnected fact about dignity, is that it is also bound up with the specificity of political and historical conjuncture. In his study of Nicaraguan food safety inspectors, Nading sets the bureaucratic routines he finds against the backdrop of calls for one-size-fits-all good governance and the structural violence inherent in a fractured state. Noronha and colleagues arranged to hear from two sets of Indian security guards at a time when globalization has intensified the use of informal, casual, and contract labor, and when the vast majority of people in the country, including both sets of guards, are engaged in precarious employment. The Observer's campaign for dignity at home in the United Kingdom references an austerity program that had brought sustained cuts to health and welfare spending, reduced financial support for local authorities, and the privatization of procedures for assessing eligibility for benefits. The question is not just what is it to treat a person with dignity, or how is dignity produced or not produced, but what is it to treat a person with dignity, and how is dignity produced or not produced under those conditions. To situate dignity in relation to wider systemic trends, patterns, and forces is to draw into the frame the complex politics of dignity. The heroic masculinity of Hamilton and colleagues' garbage workers gestures towards its gender politics. Calls to restore the dignity of the people in the Arab Spring gesture towards its nationalist or democratic politics. Dignity is individual and collective, public and private, agentic and structural. It is universal and unequal, axiomatic and illusory, a right, as we shall see in my next lecture, but also a privilege that maps with grim clarity the contours of our exploitative processes of social production and reproduction. The deposit by a Scottish charity of dignity boxes in areas with high levels of deprivation amply illustrates that. Recognizing dignity as political carries a reminder furthermore that if our subject is dignity, it is necessarily also indignity. Indignity is, of course, the antonym of dignity, yet there is a lot that we will miss if we approach indignity solely as dignity's opposite or deficient pair. We would be wrong to treat indignity as a simple lack of dignity to be filled or absence of dignity awaiting presence, because indignity, and with it the presumptively undignified, are uniquely instructive guides to dignity as a worldly concept. Through them, we can learn about the workings of dignity, its classifications and delimitations, its preconceptions and consequences, and its methods and sometimes wily ways. In a book published in 1999 entitled No Shame in My Game, Catherine Newman presents research she conducted with people employed at fast food outlets in New York City. Newman was interested in the fast food workers as exemplars of the urban working poor, and one of the things she set out to investigate was how they managed to maintain their dignity while doing a job that paid wages on which they could barely survive, and in some cases actually could not survive, and that was the butt of countless, this is her words, hamburger flipping parodies and sarcastic asides. What was it that enabled them to stay the course in a stigmatized job, she asks? How did they develop the rejoinders that made it possible to recapture their dignity? The answer for Newman lay in the dignity of work. She cites statements from workers like this: "I'm not ashamed because I have a job. Most people don't, and I'm proud of myself that I decided to get up and do something at an early age. So as I look at it, I'm not on welfare, I'm doing something." Newman also emphasizes the supportive role played by co-workers and managers, sharing this story from another worker she calls Kim. "One night, this little boy came in there and cursed me out. He said, 'That's why you're working at this place. You can't get a better job.' I was upset and everything. I started crying. My manager was like, 'Kim, don't bother with him.' I'm saying, 'You got a job, you know, it's a job.'" Newman concludes that her nation's working poor do not need, in her words, their values re-engineered. Again, quoting, "They work hard at jobs the rest of us would not want because they believe in the dignity of work. Working keeps them on the right side of American culture." Or does it? In an article that appeared in 2005, Carol Cleveland reports on research she undertook with welfare recipients in Philadelphia. Her specific interest was in women who had refused work, quitting low-wage, low-status jobs to return to welfare and rely on help from charities, relatives, and friends. As she summarizes her findings, what emerged was a pattern of confrontations with authority figures at various job sites, as well as resentment of the subservience often demanded of workers in the lowest tiers of the primary economy. Cleveland tells of how such confrontations and the walkouts that followed them, again quoting from her, afforded impoverished women the chance to express their resentments about being relegated to unrewarding, low-income work, and to maintain at least the vestiges of a defiant dignity in the face of a hostile social order. These workers did not have the means, Cleveland writes, of mounting a general challenge to the status quo, but they could challenge particular representatives of it. They could challenge, end of quote, they could challenge the people who gave them enough break time only for a few puffs on a cigarette, or who ripped off the sheets of an imperfectly made hotel bed. They could say no to those who offered them nothing other than insecure, dead-end employment at poverty-level wages. Cleveland argues that contrary to the optimistic assessments of analysts like Newman, now quoting once more from Cleveland, very low-wage workers are not able to find dignity in virtually any job. Entrance into the kind of work sites to which the women she interviewed were admitted did not offer a move to the right side of American culture. Rather, these women's work experiences served notice of the chasm between themselves and more affluent Americans. Excuse me for a second. If Newman foregrounds the association of dignity with having a job, being self-reliant, and not depending on welfare, Cleveland's research brings into focus the defiant dignity of those who refuse such an understanding of dignity. The message we receive loud and clear from her interviewees is that Newman's dignity is ideology, a legitimizing maneuver designed to mask both the indignity of low-wage, insecure, dead-end jobs and the indignation that can be witnessed on the part of the poor, mostly non-white, disproportionately female workers expected to do them. More than that, the message we receive is that Newman's dignity, which is the hegemonic dignity of dominant groups and those who align their perspectives with them, dignifies such jobs with a status they do not deserve. Dignify is an interesting word, which sounds a note of caution about this noble or ennobling concept, dignity. Don't forget it signals that behind respectability, there may be unworthiness. Respect might be commanded only in the sense of being mandated by a higher authority. I want us to listen to that note of caution and stay a while with its reverberations. How does the hegemonic dignity to which I've just referred gain its power? What are the circumstances in which a privilege comes to seem like an entitlement that belongs to everyone? In an important recent history of human rights, Jessica White writes of the rise to prominence of human dignity as a pivotal element in the conceptual apparatus of human rights. I'll discuss that turn of events and the legal and philosophical developments and debates which have come in its train in some detail in my next lecture. For the moment, it will suffice to recall the opening words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the 10 December adoption of which we now celebrate as Human Rights Day. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, peace, and justice and peace in the world. And it will suffice to note that the first sentence of Article 1 of the Universal Declaration then follows up on that with a statement that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. White shows how this insistence on the dignity of all human beings cannot be understood without reference to the influence of Friedrich Hayek and his confraternity of neoliberal thinkers and business people, the Mont Pelerin Society, on the framing and shaping of human rights. Established in the year before the adoption of the Universal Declaration, the Mont Pelerin Society began its statement of aims with a warning that the central values of our civilization are in danger. Over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared, the statement of aims said. It is well known, I think, that the measures proposed by Hayek and like-minded others in London, Chicago, and elsewhere for seeing off this danger, the danger as they saw it of communism, but also, and more immediately for them, of mass politics and Keynesian economics, centered on expansion of the free market, constraint of the social state, and the transfer of public functions to private enterprise. However, White's book makes manifest that there was another dimension to their program as well. The neoliberals of Mont Pelerin, she explains, reinvented human rights as the moral language of the competitive market, developing their own account of human rights as protections for the market order. And just as they developed an account of human rights as protections for the market order, so too they tied the account to a notion of human dignity as the preserve of those who submitted to that order. As White tells it, The members of the Mont Pelerin Society believed that only the self-reliant and responsible could lead dignified lives. Seeking welfare from the state was inherently undignified. By their lights, dignity depended on socioeconomic arrangements in which individuals were responsible for their own fates. White mentions Article 23 Article 23, paragraph 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which the concept of dignity again appears. It says, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. If the members of the Mont Pelerin Society, now quoting from White, rejected both the idea of a just wage and the idea that social protection was a right, White highlights that a concomitant of their moralized market was investment in this, again, her words, gendered vision of family welfare and the association of dignity with work. Yet the story is complicated, for as Imogen Tyler demonstrates in a study that deals with more recent times, the association of dignity with work can also be found on the other side of the political spectrum. A particular focus of Tyler's research is the demonization of working class people in 21st century Britain, perhaps best captured by Owen Jones in his book Chavs, along with responses to that demonization from the left. Tyler points out that one response, one rebuttal, emphasizes the reality of working class dignity and evokes that working class dignity by means of such observations as that those in jobs paying little more than benefits have a remarkably strong work ethic, that carers and cleaners do essential work well despite lack of money or respect, and that so-called chav mums are in fact, and this is now something that Jones writes in his book Chavs, are in fact willing to work. Tyler remarks that the creation of the noble suffering worker has been a central strategy for post-war left politics since the Second World War, while acknowledging that this has facilitated the articulation of class solidarities and the repudiation of class contempt. She argues that it has also sustained a distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor, and between, to quote from her, honest, hard-working families and a parasitical, pathological underclass. To her mind, the answer to demonization is not to point to a mismatch, again quoting, a mismatch between vilifying class names, chav and so on the one hand, and actual working class dignity on the other. Rather, it's to challenge, in her words, the forms of classificatory violence that are expressed in and carried forward by those names. It's to understand, she says, how the relevant representations of self and other are formed and how they might be transformed. How representations of self and other are formed and how they might be transformed is a big question, and a mark perhaps of the distance I've traveled in this lecture, which is itself a mark of the span and scope of the issues, perspectives, and phenomena that get caught up in my topic. Dignity is what Antonio Guterres calls for COVID-19 measures to take into account, and what Michael Gerson laments that former US President Trump lacks. But as one learns from Jessica White and Imogen Tyler, it is also an element of what was mobilized to bring about the moralization of the competitive market, And it needs to be related as well to the classificatory violence that is integral to social hierarchy. Dignity is a matter of how we are, so to speak, with ourselves, the narratives we develop about our identities and our lives. Remember the English refuse collectors and the Indian security guards. But it is also a matter of what our encounters are like with others, how we are treated day to day, what we do, what we are allowed to do and to be. Remember the psychiatric nurse saying, "I let her keep her dignity." Dignity is useless, but also essential. It is hegemonic, but it can be defiant. Dignity is a waterless shampoo and a management strategy. It is conceptualized as a distinct entity or object, something that enters our scene and passes among us, but also as something that is inextricably mixed up with the messiness of the experiential, the unfolding of bodies into worlds, and the drama of how we are touched by what comes near, to borrow some felicitous phrases from Sarah Ahmed. In this lecture, I have focused particularly on that latter way of thinking, the way of thinking that sets dignity within the messy experiential. My next lecture will take up more orderly concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. That was magnificent. And I think I speak for many when I say I cannot wait for it to be 6 o'clock tomorrow so that we can hear the next installment. So please do join us then. And until then, thank you. Good evening. Until tomorrow. Bye-bye.